In this video, I'm going to share my workflow on how to color grade with phantom LUTs to get even more dynamic range from cameras like the Sony A7sIII, the FX3 and the A7IV. What's up YouTube, Jarcraft here with another exciting tutorial. What I mean by more dynamic range is that a lot of users simply apply the LUT and then do a few tweaks to white balance and contrast. In some cases this is actually enough, but more often than not you will find that just applying the LUT at 100% will give you blown out highlights you're unable to bring back by simply dropping a slider. To me this is such a waste because you can always squeeze out more performance from your camera if you're willing to take that extra step. What I'm going to teach you is how to maximize on dynamic range with a simple tool included in all video editors, from DaVinci Resolve to Premiere Pro and Final Cut. If you're still wondering how to expose for phantom LUTs with S-Log3, I made a dedicated video about it you can watch over here. Now let's jump in.
Alright, so here we are in DaVinci Resolve. I'm going to show you a few before and afters, and if you are using Premiere Pro or Final Cut, don't sweat because you still will be able to follow along as it's pretty much the same principles. And the first example, I'm just going to focus on a basic LUT conversion and how easy it is when you actually nail your settings in camera. Okay, so this is actually a shot where I didn't overexpose. Like I said, you have the option to overexpose to get more dynamic range, but in this case I actually just got the right exposure. And this is what you want to do if you want that fast workflow and you don't really want to do too much grading, but you still want that beautiful dynamic range. So we're going to go into the color tab over here and we'll create a new node just so that you can see that we're starting from scratch. I'll open my waveform, and the first step is really simple. I'm going to do a LUT conversion. A lot of people prefer not to use LUTs at all, but actually I use LUTs a lot, especially like I mentioned, those faster turnarounds, and generally just if it gives me a nice look. So I really love these phantom LUTs by Joel Famularo. I'm going to use the Uri neutral look. That is the LUT at 100%, and I'm already like, wow, is this image is ready to go. It's really good. I can tweak it a little bit more if I wish, but if I had to export this image I would be happy with it. And that's just because I nailed the exposure in camera and the white balance is pretty much on the money. There's a slight cast. I can see there's a little bit of lack of red in the blacks over here if you look at the blacks. So I can fix that by just pushing the red up a little bit. And then I could check myself on the skin tones. I'll create a new node on that. And just to make sure the white balance is correct and the vector scope is telling me that it's on the money, it's exactly on the line. So that tells me that I did the white balance correct in camera, and then I'll just quickly do some softening over here. This is for me similar to like a mist filter. It just adds a nice softer look to it, nice soft to soften the skin. And I really like this look. I mean, you saw how quick that was. And this is what I love about exposing correctly and not having to fuss about it afterwards. Okay, next example is a little bit more advanced, and that's because we actually overexposed this shot. So I'm just going to share my workflow in how I do this when I do the overexposing, and just see how we actually get a little bit more dynamic range and get some of the highlights back. Okay, so we're going to start over here. I'm actually not going to do the entire thing from scratch. What I will do is break it down step by step. So I'm going to disable all the nodes in DaVinci, and I'm just going to leave, this is my LUT conversion. I never do it in the beginning. I have to do some changes before that, and I'll explain that now. So as you can see, the only thing I'm doing here is the Joel Famularo LUT, nothing else, and it's at 100%. So if you do before, after, beautiful. I love this look, but it's not 100% there yet. For me, it's too punchy. So what I want to do here is just bring the extremes down. In this case, the extremes are these highlights at the back. Okay, and I'm going to do that by actually qualifying it. So I did it with the qualifier. This is probably the thing I use the most when doing stuff in S-Log3 and dynamic range. I make sure that I select the entire hue spectrum, all the saturation, and I just play with the luminance. Okay. And if I select it over here, there we can see, okay? I'm basically selecting the extremes based on luminosity. If I drag it down, you can see how I'm slowly starting to select more things. It's selecting basically everything within the full color range at a certain luminosity, okay? I can undo that, and this is more or less where I want it. I put a slight feather to it over there. so that's nice and smooth. And basically I just dropped the highlights. Over there you can see how it's actually going up. And then if I go back like this and disable it, there you can see it just really softens out the background. That's kind of distracting. It just gives us that nice dynamic range look. And then the reason I did this before the actual LUT conversion is just because when you disable the LUT, you can see if I go before, after, it's making the change before any clipping can happen. If we were to do it afterwards, if there was a lot of clipping happening over here and we do this afterwards, we're actually not working with the same information anymore. So it's always better to do your extremes in the beginning before you actually do the LUT conversion. The cool thing about DaVinci is that you can actually see how it looks even after the LUT is applied. Next, again, we're doing white balance over here. I like to do it before my LUT conversion, and in this case there's barely anything happening. You might not even be able to see it with your eyes, but if I do it before and after, before, after, before, after, there's a slight change happening here. It's just some minor tweaks that I did, mainly focusing on skin tones using the vector scope. Next, I'll focus on the overall exposure of the image. In this case, because I overexposed, I have to bring down the highlights and the midtones. That's the before, that's the after. You can see I brought down the highlights over there. And in this case, the shadows are barely changing, and that's because I'm not touching the shadows, and that's how we get a little bit more dynamic range in the lows. Then one more final touch over here is I'm just going to qualify the skin tone. You can see the selection. I'm going to explain that now, but just look at the before and after. Before, after. Really like that. Before, after. Again, it's just softening the skin and just making the exposure a little bit more even and more in line of where I want it. If we look on the waveform, there's a very subtle drop over there. And the way I did that was by qualifying the skin tone. That's the first thing, using the qualification tool. I use this all the time. I'm not going to do the entire selection, but as you can see, I can play around with the skin tone until I find the perfect selection. And then what I can also do is I actually am using a slight mask over here, and that's just to make sure that I'm not including anything else in the shot like that. I just wanted to focus on the face, and that's also something you can do in all your other editors. And then a slight drop in the highlights. There we can see a slight drop in the highlights and a little bit in the midtones. Again, nothing in the shadows. And before, after, just really like that look. And the rest I'm just leaving open. I don't have to do anything else, but I like to leave my nodes open. If I needed to do some kind of a noise reduction, I can do that in the end. Some people prefer to do it in the beginning. That's open for debate. This is a really clean image, and yeah, I really like what I'm able to accomplish with just a few tweaks. Next, this is probably one of my favorite examples. Main reason is just because of that exceptional dynamic range we're getting here. It really blows my mind that Sony cameras are able to do this, and this is the reason I'm shooting in S-Log3. So I'm going to break it down. Again, not going to do it from scratch. It's going to take too long, but we will disable all the nodes and start just with the LUT. Now, if I disable the LUT, enable the LUT, you'll see something interesting happening over here. Look at the sky over there, okay? This is the after, before, after, before, after. The sky is barely changing, okay? And this is where the big change comes in compared to the previous example. So I'm going to disable this LUT and just use a random node, because a lot of people will just do this. I'm actually going to use another one. I'm going to use the Utopia LUT from Joel Famularo. And now, as you can see, look how blown out the sky is over there, okay? This is way too much, and this is an example of extremes. Even based on a previous example of extremes, this is way more extreme. Okay, and this is where I'm doing something different, okay? If we go back to our LUT selection over here, we're gonna use the qualifier tool, okay? Again, like the previous example, doing the full U range, the full saturation range, and then only working with the luminosity value. If I select it, you can see this entire part is not being used, and I'm actually applying the LUT. That means the LUT's only being applied to this part of the image, okay? Only based on luminosity values. If I drag it around, you should be able to see. There we go. And this is where you have to be really careful. You have to be careful to do this right, because it will not work in every scenario, because you might end up with a halo effect. Okay? Now, after doing this, I have to do something to the sky, okay? Because this is super bland. So in this case, I did the same effect, but instead of applying the LUT, I just did some adjustments. So there we can see I'm just selecting the sky, everything, all the hue, all the saturation, but just some of the luminosity. Again, now I'm focusing on the highlights. If I drag into the lows, you can see how I'm starting to select more of the image, but I'm not going to do that. And in this case, I am just adding saturation. I didn't even bring the highlights down because this is really actually clipping. It's already too much to bring down, but just adding a little bit of saturation, it just makes it look a lot more natural. And then I want to fix the white balance. Now I'm not going to do it 100% because I still like the look, but basically this LUT, Ari Utopia, if we go to the Joel Famularo, there we go. It definitely has a green tint to it, but also there's a lot of green in the mountains. It's bouncing everywhere. And then last but not least, I did use an ND filter. And the one I used in this example does have a slight green tint to it, so I just have to fix that. Okay, I'm not going to do the full breakdown. There we can see that's the after, before, after. I love this. This is a really good image and it makes a big difference. Again, I'm not saying the green is wrong. If you want to go for that, that's fine, as long as your skin tone is more natural. In this case, it's too green, so there we go. That's a bit more of a natural skin tone. Okay, the way I did that was actually utilizing the vector scope. This is a really nice method to quickly do white balance. In this case, if I do the before and after, you can see how I'm just bringing that into the center. And that's, again, that's making a big difference because it's where the midtones lie. So by just bringing this thing into the center, you can just play around with the wheel over here. There's the after, just like that, until you find it in the center. And that's pretty simple. And if we enable again, you can see, there we go. And then the next step is just the exposure value, just basically bringing down a little bit more, just adding some punch to it, because I don't want it to look too dynamic. I still do want to drop the shadows a little bit. If I look at the waveform over here, you can see I did a drop over here, and everything's happening over there. I didn't touch the highlights and I didn't touch the midtones. I basically just drop the shadows. And looking at this, it just looks a little bit more natural. You don't want to have your image looking too HDR. In this case, just dropping the shadows a little bit down gives it a little bit more natural look.
Using the HSL qualifier on separate nodes or layers can really help you isolate key areas to bring down and preserve highlights, or even shadows for that matter. You can take it a step further with masking, but I'll leave that for another tutorial. If you have any more questions, drop it in the comments below and I'll do my best to answer. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.